Blessed Anne Catherine was born to a Catholic family in Flamschen, Germany on September 8, 1774. She was a mystic and a stigmatist and is said to have had visions of the life of the Blessed Mother and the passion and death of Jesus. Actor and director Mel Gibson used her writings as an inspiration for the movie The Passion. Since these revelations are private and no one knows if they have been exaggerated by the poet Clemens Baciano, who wrote them down as told by Anne Catherine, they have never been officially approved by the Catholic Church. However, there is nothing contrary about them against the faith and can be a good way to ponder Jesus' life and sufferings this Lent. For this video, we focus on who Anne Catherine was and the life that God designed for her to live as a suffering soul. As a child, Anne Catherine was favored with many visions of the Blessed Mother, saints, her guardian angel, and Jesus as the Good Shepherd. This was so common for her that she thought that all children had visions from heaven. Many times, her heavenly visitors would come to her in a form of a child, such as her guardian angel. As she took care of the sheep in the fields, Jesus at times appeared to her as a young shepherd and would assist her as needed. In the beginning, since these visions were so natural to her and part of her everyday life, she would talk about them with others, but the reactions disturbed her peace of mind, and so she stopped talking about them altogether. Even as a child, Anne Catherine had a very sensitive spirit and a natural intuition between good and evil. For instance, when a priest walked down the road carrying the Blessed Sacrament, she would feel a strong attraction in the direction he was coming from, even if he was so far away she couldn't hear or see him coming. She would run to meet him and kneel on the road until he passed her. She also had a very strong intuition about evil. If she happened to come upon any plants used for superstitious practices, she would dig them up and throw them away. Or if she happened to be playing in a spot where a crime was committed, she would hastily run away or pray and do penance. When a relic was shown to her, she knew what saint that relic belonged to without being told. She was in almost constant communion with the saints in purgatory, offering up prayers and sacrifices for them. One time she was woken up in the middle of the night by suffering souls, who bid her to follow them on a cold winter's night with bare feet, to follow the way of the cross to Coesfeld. Anne Catherine's schooling was very short. She was needed at home to help the family on the farm. In truth, because she was such a strange child who was praying almost all the time, or quiet because she knew her visions were misunderstood, she didn't do much socializing with other children. In fact, she made a promise to herself one day that she would no longer converse with other children, but only with Jesus. She slept on wooden planks with her arms out in the form of a cross, and ate food that no one else wanted or had thrown away. When she wasn't in ecstasy or having visions, she was usually found kneeling in the snow where she would pray for hours. God did not want Anne Catherine to live a normal life. He chose her to be set apart, and so she was, so much that no one knew what to think of her. Not too surprising, she wanted to be a nun, but because her family was so poor and unable to pay her dowry, no cloister would take her. When she was 24 years old, she received the crown of thorns from Jesus. She writes, "When kneeling in the Jesuit church in Coesfeld, absorbed in prayer, I suddenly felt a strong but pleasant heat in my head, and I saw my divine spouse, under the form of a young man clothed with light, come toward me from the altar where the Blessed Sacrament was preserved in the tabernacle. In his left hand he held a crown of flowers, in his right hand a crown of thorns, and he bade me to choose which one I would have. I chose the crown of thorns. He placed it on my head, and I pressed it down with both hands. Then he disappeared, and I returned to myself, feeling, however, violent pain around my head. Outwardly, nothing showed, although the pain of the crown of thorns was so immense that the next day her forehead and temples had swelled. Later, small spots of blood appeared on her temple, although Anne Catherine wasn't aware of this until someone, who knew nothing about what happened, told her that she should put on a new cap because there was blood on her old one. At 28 years old, she joined the Augustinians nuns, although sadly, her spiritual trials only intensified. Although most of the nuns are very good and pious, some were not, and found Anne Catherine's zeal annoying. She overheard many criticisms and uncharitable things that were said behind her back, and when she tried to apologize to those who were offended, she was accused of eavesdropping at doors. To add to her problems, God granted Sister Anne Catherine the gift of tears, and so she spent much of the day in tears over the sins of the world, the community, and her own sins. Those around her, however, mistook the tears of discontentment or self-pity. Because Anne Catherine hungered for Holy Communion to the point where she no longer could be satisfied by earthly foods, she would pass out from hunger and even came close to dying a few times. So her confessor decided she must receive communion more often than the other nuns. This too separated her from the sisters, as some of them experienced a spiritual jealousy at all the spiritual gifts that she received from God. Because of all the jealousy and resentment that had built against her from the other sisters, Anne Catherine begged God continuously to make reparation. The thought of being the reason to cause someone to sin pained her continuously. Around Christmas of the year 1802, she became very sick with a lot of pain around her heart. The pain didn't leave her, even when she became well again. In fact, she would suffer this pain for 11 years, and as a result, the mark of a cross was imprinted in the same place of her pain, both interiorly and externally. When Sister Anne Catherine was able, she worked in the convent house and the garden and serving others. Inwardly, however, she was always suffering from a spiritual ailment on the behalf of others. She was able to hide this at times, but most of the time she bore this sacrifice through sicknesses. She had offered herself to take on the sufferings of others, sometimes the expiation of sins, or the sufferings for the souls in purgatory, and God allowed this by giving her both spiritual and physical sufferings. As her desire to suffer for others increased, so did her spiritual atonements, in the form of illnesses, which was very puzzling to the sisters in the convent. She was put under the care of a doctor who followed her health, prescribing remedies and cures that didn't help, and in fact usually made things worse. Sister Anne Catherine writes, "Even had I fully comprehended my state and had both time and power to explain it, there is no one near who would have been able to understand me. A doctor would simply have concluded that I was entirely mad and would have increased his expensive and painful remedies tenfold. I have suffered much in this way during the whole of my life, and particularly when I was at the convent. Often, when the doctors and nurses had reduced me to the last agony and I was near death, God took pity on me and sent me some supernatural assistance, which effected an entire cure." On December 3, 1811, the convent was suppressed by the king and the nuns dispersed in different directions. Only Anne Catherine, who was too unwell to move, stayed, along with a priest who said Mass at the convent and a fellow worker who stayed out of charity to take care of her. They stayed until spring of 1812, and the priest found another place for Sister Anne Catherine to stay. She stayed with a poor widow, where Anne stayed in a small room in the basement. As she was praying in bed one day, Jesus appeared to her and with his right hand made the sign of the cross over her body. A small cross on her chest formed, and later broke into blisters as if from a burn, and the blisters caused her to soak several sheets on her bed. Later, another small cross appeared on her chest. And then, weeks later, when out on an errand with her landlady's daughter, Sister Anne Catherine fell into ecstasy, where a third cross appeared on her breastbone. This cross became very red and at other times would bleed. She confided in a nun about all this, whom she was very close with at the time, about the strange phenomenon, and this, of course, got everyone else talking about it. On December of 1812, she received the 5 wounds of Christ. She had been praying for this special favor when she suddenly saw a light descending toward her. Then triple rays, colored red as blood, darted toward her hands, feet, and side. It was a landlady's little daughter who found her on the floor bleeding, and she ran to get her mother. Catherine Anne begged her to not say anything about this to anyone. This was kept a secret until one day one of the sisters from the convent discovered her secret, and soon everyone in town knew about it. From here on out, Anne Catherine had little to no privacy, as she was examined by the parish priest, who then had a doctor examine her, who was brought in by another doctor, and that doctor brought in other medical examiners. Perhaps the one bright side is that she finally won the respect of her superiors, who treated her with much more kindness and respect. Although it was discouraged, people visited Sister Anne Catherine, some out of curiosity, some out of veneration. People walked out of her room convinced that she was either a saint or a fraud. Anne Catherine dealt with constant interruptions, questions, and examinations with patients as she considered this an additional suffering for souls. People treated her as though she was something to be gawked at and handled like a tool, instead of with dignity. And when one man complained about the stairs being too difficult to access to her room, he suggested that she be laid outside so all the public could see her. It's not said for how long she had to stay out on the road, if it was days, weeks, or months, but she lay in the form of a cross as people passed by, some insulting her and others venerating her. Eventually, she was moved to a different house, where she was kept for observation, as many people suspected that she was a fraud. Seeing that the stigmata caused so much trouble to everyone, Anne Catherine begged God to remove the stigmata, even if it was just outwardly, but he did not grant this until 7 years later. Even then, she would bleed and suffer on certain days, such as Good Friday. This would happen repeatedly for the next several years. Her wounds would reopen, her head and side would bleed, as well as the cross on her heart. Again, the curious people came by, wanting to see those who didn't even believe in the wounds of Christ. As stated before, Anne Catherine also suffered other people's trials for them. Her sufferings often took on the symbolic role of a person's cross. Many times her sufferings started without her knowing right away who she was suffering for. One time, Anne Catherine suddenly started suffering the effects of consumption, excessive sweating, irritation of the lungs with violent coughing, and a high fever. On top of this was a strong temptation toward irritability. If she ever gave in to this temptation even a little bit, she would immediately burst into tears and wouldn't get any relief until she received the sacrament of penance. She also had to fight a temptation of aversion for a certain person whom she had not seen in years. This created horrible anxiety, and she continued to weep bitterly, saying things that didn't make sense to those around her. She continued to get worse and worse, and everyone thought it was just a matter of time until she died. So they were very surprised when suddenly she sat up and said very clearly, "Repeat with me prayers for those in their last agony." The people that were with her said the litany for the dying, Anne Catherine's voice getting stronger and stronger as she prayed. Not too much longer after this, someone came in the room asking for Anne Catherine's prayers for his sister who had just died. Anne Catherine asked for details concerning the woman's sickness and death, and the brother described all the symptoms of consumption that Anne Catherine had just suffered herself. The woman had been in so much pain that she was unable to prepare herself for death. During her last hours, she made peace with God and with the person whom she was in enmity with, and died peacefully. All of Anne Catherine's symptoms had now disappeared, and her friends said in astonishment, "When this illness came upon you, this woman grew better, and the hatred for another was the only obstacle in making her peace with God. You took upon her feelings of hatred, and now that she has died, do you still suffer?" "No, indeed," Anne Catherine replied. "That would be most unreasonable. But how can one avoid suffering when even the end of her finger is in pain? We are all one body in Christ." "Well, now you can rest a while," her friend said. "Not for long," Anne Catherine said with a smile. "There are others who want my assistance." She was right, for not too long after that, as a friend of hers sat with her, she fell into ecstasy. Suddenly she said out loud, "Oh, my sweet Jesus, allow me to carry that heavy stone." Her friend asked her what was the matter. She replied, "I'm on my way to Jerusalem, and I see a poor man walking along with the greatest difficulty, carrying a heavy stone on his chest. The weight of it nearly crushes him." Then after a few moments she said again, "Give me that heavy stone. You cannot carry it any farther. Give it to me." Then suddenly she sank down as if crushed beneath a heavy burden. At the same time, her friend felt himself relieved of the weight of sorrow that had oppressed him, and an overwhelming happiness came over him. Looking over at Anne Catherine, he asked her what was wrong, not understanding that she had taken over his sorrow. She looked at him with a smile and said, "I cannot remain here any longer. Poor man, you must take your burden back." Instantly, he felt the weight of his affliction return to him. When Anne Catherine was a child, one of her jobs was to pull weeds that had nettles among them. When her hands were getting stung by the nettles, she would offer up the pain for those who were lax in their faith. Her sufferings took on the symbolism according to one's state of life, and one day, while in ecstasy, her hands began to move as though she was pulling weeds. Then her hands and arms began to get red and blistered, which caused pain and itching, similar to what she suffered when pulling nettles. She implored those around her to pray for a special intention. The next day, her arms and hands were even more red and swollen, and when asked for the reason, she said, "I've had so many nettles to root up in the vineyard, because those whose duty to do it only pulled off the stems, and I was obliged to pull the roots out through stony soil." The person who had asked the question then began to blame these careless workmen, but Anne Catherine surprised him by saying, "Actually, you are one of them. Those who only pull off the stems of nettles but leave the roots are praying carelessly." Later, it was discovered that she had been praying and suffering for several dioceses who were shown to her in the appearance of a vineyard and in much need of rooting out many weeds and nettles. Later, Anne Catherine's visions were of Jesus and Mary's life depending on the liturgical time of the year. This went on for the last years of her life. All of what she described while in ecstasy was written down by her poet friend. As death came closer, her suffering increased dramatically. In 1823, during the Christmas season, Anne Catherine said, "This Christmas, the child Jesus has only brought me a cross and instruments of suffering." Her sufferings did increase, with a raging fever and pain so intense that all she could do was to sit upright, as laying down caused her to suffocate. She received the sacraments for the last time, and when a friend tried to reposition her in bed to make her more comfortable, she said, "I am on the cross. It will all be over soon. Leave me in peace." She also suffered great torment of mind and soul, scrutinizing every sin she had ever made, no matter how small. Any sort of murmured adoration or praise from others brought her further pain and agitation. She said, "Ah, for the love of God, do not praise me. That keeps me here longer, and then I have double to suffer. God alone is good." And again, "I cannot die if so many good persons think well of me through a mistake. I beg of you to tell them that I am a wretched sinner." At last she passed through the storm, and she was able to tell the priest, "I feel now as peaceful and as filled with hope and confidence as if I had never committed a sin." At 8:00 p.m., her agony again intensified, and she cried out 3 times, "O God, assist me! O Lord, come!" The priest rang the bell in her room that signaled to others that the end was near. "She's dying," he told them, and they all knelt to pray. They were given lighted tapers, which she also held, her hand supported by a priest. After giving a few sighs, she sank down on the pillows and died. It was 8:15 p.m. on February 9, 1824. She was 49 years old. She was buried in a humble cemetery. In the evening after her burial, a rich man asked permission to buy the body at a high price for a Dutch doctor who wanted to use it for study. This was rejected, of course, but word got around, and soon there were rumors that Anne Catherine's body had been stolen. About 6 or 7 weeks after her death, it was decided to open her coffin to put everyone's fears to rest. Upon opening it, they found that her body was incorrupt, with a sweet smile on her face. When closing her coffin again, a large stone was placed on top over her grave. On October 3, 2004, St. Pope John Paul II beatified Anne Catherine.